Now, the endocrine system is a really interesting system. It involves a lot of different organs playing together, from organs in the brain, such as the hypothalamus, the pituitary, to your reproductive organs, to your skin. Endocrine organs are all over our body, okay? A lot of diffuse different functions in the endocrine system, okay? So we're gonna speak about the primary and secondary types of endocrine glands, distinguishing organs that release hormones as their main function and some organs that release hormones as their secondary function, okay? Now, endocrine glands are derived from epithelial tissue. We spoke about epithelial tissue early on this semester. We talked about tissues that have that lining epithelium, right? The GI tract is lined by epithelium, blood vessels, et cetera, et cetera. And we also mentioned that glands is another important function of epithelial cells or epithelial tissues. Now, there are two main types of endocrine organs, primary and secondary. And just to distinguish them, primary organs, this is their main job. This is their main function, exclusively secreting these endocrine hormones, okay? Let's go through this list of a few primary endocrine glands. Hypothalamus and the pituitary. These are the master endocrine glands. These are what I like to think of as the CEO. These are at the top in that chain of command of communication, okay? They make sort of executive decisions about the other endocrine glands, okay? And they're found in the brain. We should know this already. On a midsection of the brain, we can see the hypothalamus, we can see the pituitary easily. Then there's the pineal gland, also in this midsection of the brain, centrally located, also can easily be seen on a cross section or a mid-sagittal section. The pineal gland controls our circadian rhythm and our sleep-wake cycle. We'll talk about that. They're the thyroid gland and parathyroid glands. So the parathyroids are embedded posteriorly in the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland sits in the neck, right around our cartilage of the trachea. We'll talk about the important functions of thyroid hormone. The thymus gland is another important primary endocrine organ. The thymus is located anterior to the heart, right? So in the anterior mediastinum, right behind the sternum. And it's a very interesting organ. It has some function in the immune system as well. We'll talk about the thymus. The adrenal glands, very, very, very important glands here. They have two functions, one which we looked at involved in the autonomic nervous system, but the cortex of the adrenal gland. The cortex is responsible for some endocrine hormone release, okay, or secretion. Whereas the medulla, which is the inside part of the adrenal gland, is responsible for autonomic hormone release. The pancreas and the gonads are also involved. The pancreas is going to also have a dual function. It functions in our digestive juices to help break down food, as well as an endocrine hormone. And then the gonads obviously have multiple functions, right? Reproduction, but also hormone functions as well. So these are the main glands that we'll look at today. We'll talk about exactly what hormones affect these glands and what hormones these glands release in turn. Let's talk about the secondary endocrine glands. These include the heart. Now we know the heart's main function is to pump blood and is a part of the vascular and circulatory system, but it also secretes some hormones that are involved in the endocrine system as well. And so in this way, it's a secondary endocrine organ. The kidneys secrete erythropoietin, and this hormone is a precursor to creating new red blood cells. So this also functions in the endocrine system. The GI system, lots of different hormones here. CCK, secretin, gastrin. We'll talk about these when we look at the GI system next semester. But these are also important hormones that are released as a secondary function of the GI tract. The liver secretes insulin-like growth factors. We'll talk about the liver today and the effect of growth hormone on the liver. The skin acts as an endocrine organ, and fat, your fat tissues, adipose cells, can also secrete hormones such as leptin, which vary with your hunger levels. Okay, so these are some of the organs or glands that have a secondary role to play in the endocrine system. Okay, so they have other functions, but they do play a part. Okay, let's move on to objective 2. So we'll talk about the link between the hypothalamus, the anterior and posterior pituitary, okay? Now, let's start by looking at the hypothalamus. So again, it's centrally located in the brain, So this is the hypothalamus. Okay, we should remember the thalamus being this region, and just beneath the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus has some nerve endings in this region, and these nerve endings communicate to the pituitary, okay? So we have neurosecretory cells located in the hypothalamus. What I'm really trying to say here is that the hypothalamus communicates directly with the pituitary, okay? And so it's like, again, that chain of command where there's a boss, a central CEO that's communicating to someone else, which happens to be the pituitary. When we get to the pituitary, there are two lobes, anterior and posterior. The posterior is neurohypophysis, meaning that it's neural tissue there. We'll see the nerve endings that come down from the hypothalamus located in the posterior lobe. The anterior lobe receives a portal circulation, and I'll describe what that means, okay? So basically the posterior lobe has neurons, and the anterior lobe has that portal circulation, and I'll talk about what that means in a bit. And then finally, the infundibulum is the stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. So this stalk-like connection here, this is called the infundibulum, and it bridges or facilitates that communication from hypothalamus down to pituitary. Alrighty, any questions so far? Any questions? Okay. Now, when we speak about the hypothalamus and the pituitary, there are neurohormones released. And these are hormones that are released by neurons in the endocrine system, okay? Now, when I say released, so the somas or the cell bodies of these neurons are up here in the hypothalamus, but then the axons extend all the way down into the posterior pituitary, okay? And so basically when these hormones are released into the posterior pituitary blood, they're actually coming from the hypothalamus. They're being secreted. They're being synthesized in the hypothalamus. They travel down and they're released from the axon terminals of these axons, okay? So a very important distinction to make, that the posterior pituitary hormones are not made in the posterior pituitary. They're made up in the hypothalamus. They're synthesized there, and then they are released from the posterior pituitary, okay, where these axons end. So there are two hormones released here. There's ADH and oxytocin. ADH is also called antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin, and this is made in the paraventricular nucleus in the hypothalamus. So this is the nucleus, and we call a nucleus a cluster of these somas or a cluster of these cell bodies, and this is where ADH is made. It's made, it's stored, and released here. Okay, very, very important distinction to make. ADH functions in water balance regulation. So it determines our osmolarity, meaning how salty, what the solute concentration of our plasma is, and it can modify the kidneys in their amount of water reabsorption. Okay, that's how ADH acts. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is also released from the posterior pituitary, but it's made in the hypothalamus as well from a different nucleus, okay, from the supraoptic nucleus. So again, these cluster of cell bodies that make up the supraoptic nucleus, these are the cells that are making oxytocin. It's then stored and released from the posterior pituitary, okay? Oxytocin is important in milk ejection or milk letdown from the breast, so not production. We'll talk about what hormone influences milk production, but only milk letdown or milk ejection, okay? So it acts on those ejaculatory ducts to facilitate lactation. Okay. All right. Everyone with me so far? Any questions? Okay. So let's speak about tropic hormones here. We'll talk about tropic hormones and the portal system. Okay. Now, tropic hormones are the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus, from these neurosecretory cells, and they travel to the anterior pituitary here. Okay. Very important to distinguish what happens in the posterior pituitary, those two hormones that we just mentioned, from what's happening here in the anterior pituitary. Now, the tropic hormones can either excite the anterior pituitary to release a hormone, or it can inhibit the anterior pituitary. So we have releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones, okay? And we'll mention that throughout today. So RH will stand for a releasing hormone, IH will stand for an inhibiting hormone. Now, when we speak about the portal system, a portal system is any time blood goes from the heart to a structure, to a capillary bed, and then leaves that capillary bed and does not go back to the heart. It goes to another capillary bed. Okay, we see the portal system with the liver, and we see the portal system here with the anterior pituitary. So fresh oxygenated blood leaves the heart, travels to the hypothalamus here, leaves the hypothalamus. Now, the normal rule of circulation is that whenever deoxygenated blood leaves a tissue, it should go back to the heart to be reoxygenated again. We don't see that here. And you can see that this blood is purple, meaning that it's been partially deoxygenated. And so this partially deoxygenated blood doesn't go back to the heart, but actually goes down to the anterior pituitary. And this is what makes this a portal system, okay? Blood leaves a capillary bed and goes to another capillary bed. All right, and so we have the exchange of blood and hormones being released here from the anterior pituitary, and they make their way into that blood, which is now heading back to the heart, now heading into the venous circulation. Okay? So 2 capillary beds in series is a portal system. All right. So what happens here is this portal system facilitates the movement of these hormones from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. So the hormones that are released here, whether they're stimulating or inhibiting hormones, travel in this portal blood, right, in this partially deoxygenated blood, down to the anterior pituitary, and they can influence the anterior pituitary to either stimulate secretion or to inhibit secretion. So this is what I mean by that chain of events, that chain of command. So the hypothalamus must speak to or must instruct the pituitary. The pituitary will in turn speak to or instruct the other endocrine organs that we're going to talk about. So there's that chain of command, okay?